Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the RASBJ online talk on Shanghai Demimondaine. This is a brand new book, and we have with us not only the author, Nick Hordern, but also our dear friend, Paul French, also an author, and they will have a conversation about this fascinating woman who, there are just so many themes here that relate to us. 1930s Shanghai. Her world spanned the brothels of Shanghai, but she also rubbed elbows with people in high society in London, and she even worked in the library of the Royal Asiatic Society in London. I know everyone's eager to hear from you guys, so take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Melinda. Hi, everyone. Thanks for making the time. When I got sent a fairly early copy of this book, I was kind of really shocked because it's not often, in fact, I can hardly think of any times in the time I've been writing about China, which is almost 25 years or something, when a book comes along out of the blue that is about something that none of us knew anything about. Right? As far as I know, no one has ever done anything on Lorraine Murray and the relationship with Emily Hahn, who we all know probably. I hopefully don't have to explain too much about Emily Hahn. And something comes along that you just didn't know. Now, I must have read, this is my copy of Emily Hahn's Miss Jill. I've had others over the years, picking them up secondhand. It's a great novel of Shanghai and a little bit of Hong Kong. It's the underbelly of Shanghai, and that always is very attractive. But I had never had an idea that it was based on a real person. I assumed that Hahn, knowing she was in Shanghai, had based it on composite characters, knowing that she had lived down on Jiangxi Road, Jiangxilu area where the bordellos famously were, that she would have just built this out as a piece of fiction, right? But as Nick will tell us, and as Nick has written in his great book, Shanghai Demimondaine, this is not the case. There was a real Miss Jill, and her life, if anything, is far more fascinating than actually Emily Hahn's novel. But I thought, Nick, what we should do first of all, as we're talking about Shanghai, as we're talking about Emily Hahn, and we haven't got a PowerPoint, but there in case anyone doesn't know what Emily Hahn looks like, is Emily Hahn. Perhaps you could explain, we'll go reverse order, right? So let's talk about the Miss Jill first. If you could give us a quick overview of Miss Jill and Emily Hahn's novel, and how that came about, then we can kind of go back and talk about Lorraine from her early days in Australia through Shanghai and her life later. But I think it's because it obviously came to you through reading the novel first, I assume, that piqued your curiosity. And if people haven't read that novel, then that's another one you should really put on your reading list.
Right. Well, okay, so Miss Jill is basically about reform of fallen women. Now, this is a very loaded and complex subject in the context of Emily Hahn's novels, but basically it opens in Shanghai in 1937. Jill is a young woman, younger in reality than Lorraine Murray was. She's an ingenue. She's effectively been trafficked into a brothel. And then one of her patrons basically persuades her to leave the brothel and adopt a more regular course of life. And the main way she's going to do that is she's going to become trained as a stenographer typist, and this will provide her with living, as it were. And once she has regained a footing in respectable society, then she will be able to go ahead and meet men in a normal, non-transactional sense, and her life will go forward. But it doesn't work out like that because Jill finds it very difficult to extract herself from that milieu. Obviously, being a typist doesn't pay nearly as well as being a worker in Madame Annette's brothel. And so in the novel, she basically fails to extract herself from that milieu. She goes to Hong Kong and she falls back into prostitution. This is in 1939, 1940, and she spends a lot of time in and out of the kind of valley from which she's trying to extract herself. Then at the end of the novel, of course, the Japanese invade Hong Kong, and Jewel goes into the internment camp at Stanley. And it is there in Stanley that she at last finds her moral compass. And she starts to get on with other people, act in a selfless fashion. And finally, she even gets a bit of religion. She comes under the guidance of a Catholic father there who somehow gives her the moral backbone, if you like, to put behind her this distasteful life she'd had as a sex worker and to face her new life as almost a reborn woman. There's now that trajectory that I've just described in Miss Jewel is what you would call the orthodox evangelical patriarchal concept of reform. It starts out with a woman who is degraded, but struggles to escape this moral morass that she's in, but with the right guidance, she comes out at the end and is a woman reborn, resolved to do better. Now, this was a huge theme in the 19th and 20th century. We've all heard about Mr. Gladstone out there in the streets, rescuing prostitutes in the streets of London. And as I said, this was an orthodox narrative. Now, that was how Miss Jewel wound it up, but that was not how Emily saw the situation. Miss Jewel wound it up like that because it spent 10 years as a manuscript, and in the end she was desperate to get it published. And I don't know this, but I infer that the publisher said, look, you've got to have a moral ending. You've got to almost have a Hollywood ending, as it were. So that's the case of Miss Jewel. But if you read China to Me, which is Emily's non-fiction memoir, you get a different view of things. And when you read the letters between the two women, you get a completely different view of things, because in those, Emily is utterly skeptical about the model of reform that I have just mentioned. Let's call it the David Copperfield model. And she is urging Lorraine to reform, but in a completely different way.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, having urged everyone to read it, that it's not the greatest novel in the world. But if you know Shanghai and you're interested in interwar Shanghai, and if you've read your book, Shanghai Demimondaine, I went back after reading your book and read this for the first time in a decade again last week, and I enjoyed it much more because I felt I was reading it almost through Hahn's head rather than just reading it as a novel I've picked up. So I think it's still worth a read. But obviously, Lorraine Murray's life herself is much more interesting, and we'll come back to when she meets Hahn and the world of the Kiangsi Road, Hong Kong Road, South Suzhou Road brothels. But I think let's just go back and first of all talk about what happens to her before she gets to Shanghai, because we need to find out how she ends up in this predicament. And I mean, first of all, she has this really quite bizarre childhood in Australia with her parents, right?
Yeah, well, in the novel, her childhood is given fairly short shrift. There is mention of a mother who's portrayed as weak and promiscuous, and there's this interlude where she's rather improbably picked up on a beach in Sydney by some rather ill-defined Japanese plutocrat who takes her abroad and makes her his mistress. And then at the end of an interval, a relationship that she has with this Japanese gentleman for about a couple of years, she is flung out of Japan by the secret police, because of the Japanese plutocrats' extensive connections, and she's on her way back to Australia through Shanghai. She stops over in Shanghai, and there she basically, being an ingenue, she loses her money and she is taken up by a seedy Hungarian count who's a trafficker who basically sells her into the sex trade. Now, Lorraine...
Nick, you're racing ahead there, racing ahead. We need to get back to the childhood and then the relationship with the Japanese gentleman. It's because it's crucial to what happens, to the trajectory, isn't it?
Absolutely. So that is what I've just told you is what we're told in Miss Jewel. The reality was this. Lorraine had a very complicated childhood, and it was overshadowed by the fact that her mother was racked with guilt about her own anomalous social standing. Lorraine's mother, Laura, had a total of 4 children by 2 fathers, all out of wedlock. And this is in Australia in the 1910s, which is a very straight-laced place. So Lorraine was basically brought up in comfortable surroundings, comfortable financially, but very uncomfortable psychologically, because the household that she grew up in was riven with her mother's fears that somehow she would be exposed as an unmarried mother, and as someone who had been having affairs with married men and so on and so forth. So Lorraine had, I think it's fair to say, a fairly troubled childhood. She was financially privileged. There's no two ways about that. But then about 1930, the money ran out, and all of a sudden Lorraine was at a turning point. Now, the year before, she had met in in Sydney, a gentleman called Tokugawa Iemasa, and he was Japan's senior diplomat in Australia at the time. His title was the Consul General to Australia and New Zealand. Now, they met in 1928, so when she was 18, he was 43. And at that stage, there was obviously some kind of interaction between the households, because Lorraine became a kind of companion friend to Tokugawa Iemasa's daughter, Toeko, and Lorraine's mother was in the household of Tokugawa Iemasa from time to time, enough so that she became friends with Tokugawa Iemasa's mistress, who's a Swedish lady called Ella Viola Strom. Then, in the course of the next 2 years, somehow Lorraine persuaded Tokugawa Iemasa by correspondence to basically take her into his household. By this stage, Tokugawa was the Japanese minister to, that's the ambassador in Toronto. She went there, and it's clear from letters that Tokugawa was writing to his former mistress, Ellis, that are now in the University of Melbourne, that's when the relationship with Tokugawa actually began. That relationship did indeed last 2 years, and at the conclusion of it, he sent her ahead of him to Japan, where she was sort of set up in Tokyo, and they resumed their relationship there. Now, the point to make here is that Tokugawa Iemasa was a very important figure indeed. He would later become the head of the eldest branch of the Tokugawa family, who, of course, a century before had provided Japan with its ruling shogunate family. And more to the point, at this stage, his wife was the aunt of the new empress. So in other words, this was a man who was very well connected at the highest levels of Japanese society. And all of a sudden he had a blonde Gaijin mistress in Tokyo. This was not what the authorities wanted to hear. And that was why she was effectively expelled from Japan, put on the ship and sent and told to go home. They said, go back to Australia, here's this money, go back to Australia, don't come back. And of course, she stopped over in Shanghai. And then we get to the interesting story of how she actually went to work in the brothel, which is again a subject of contention, but it's probably not the way Emily described it in Miss Jewel. There's probably a more complicated explanation involving more agency on Lorraine's part.
Okay, can we just for my clarification, I have 2 questions. One, when we say the relationship between Tokugawa and Lorraine during this time, when I think, initially in Australia and then I think Ottawa, were they not in Ottawa? I think
Yep.
for a while. And then when he takes her to Japan, I mean, what do we mean by this relationship? It's a mistress relationship. The Swedish woman is
it's
gone.
fully
She's the replacement for the Swede. Right?
That's right, and the Swede wasn't happy about it. But there's no doubt it was emphatically sexual. Yes.
Okay, and within the context of the times and everything, this is a very unusual thing for a senior Japanese diplomat to do, right? An aristocrat as well, right?
I'm not completely. I really don't have the the knowledge to answer that question. But certainly, it seems to me, from what I can tell, that Iemasa and his father Iesato were certainly a bit out of the mold in the sense that they were liberal, westernizing figures, more down that end of the spectrum than many of their other counterparts in Japan at the time. But I suppose one of the things I should have said right at the beginning, and the thing that Emily says, and the thing that everyone says about Lorraine, is that she was exceptionally beautiful. By the time she was 21, she was just drop dead gorgeous. And there's plenty of evidence to show that basically it didn't matter how straight-laced you were going to be attracted to her. And there he was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got a picture to hand, unfortunately, but I mean, if anyone you can just Google Lorraine Murray now, thanks to your book and the articles and reviews around it, and you can see a picture of her. Actually, I mean, together with Emily Hahn, who was also considered one of the great kind of, Shanghai lander beauties at the time as well. They make quite a striking pair, I imagine, walking down the Nanking Road at a certain time. So anyway, she's in Japan. She's still in this mistress type relationship, and yet she's kind of shunned, right? I mean, she's sort of shut away. She's not really able to do very much. No one's really talking to her. And then eventually, despite Tokugawa's supposed influence, the authorities pick her out, and she ends up on a boat to Shanghai.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the story has a slight elaboration. Initially, Tokugawa sends her to live in his house in Tokyo with his wife. And so it's part of the family house. And in Miss Jewel, that arrangement doesn't work out very well at all, because Mrs. Tokugawa is not happy with the situation, and her unhappiness manifests itself very strongly. So in this rendition of the story, Lorraine is sent, she's taken in by a geisha who was a friend of, or a connection of, Tokugawa's from way back in his youth. And it's in this period, about 3 or 4 months, when Lorraine is living in the geisha house, she becomes a kind of a student, if you like, of the arts of the geisha. And it is this sense of deference, of politeness, of quietness that later makes her such a star of the brothel in Shanghai. That is Emily Hahn's reading of the thing, that she had a polish put on her by her association with Tokugawa that later on stood her in very good stead when she came into the sex trade in Shanghai.
Okay, so let's go to Shanghai, and she arrives, and there is some talk of a Hungarian count, but how does this woman end up in the sex trade?
Right. Well, as I said, Miss Jewel is actually quite an orthodox narrative of reform, and to fit into that pattern, Miss Jewel actually has to be an ingenue, an innocent, even though she's been in this affair with Tokugawa. She has to be an innocent who is lured into this vile trade. And that's the narrative of Miss Jewel. So she runs out of money. She is befriended by this shonky Hungarian count who's promising to marry her. But in the meantime, oh dear, we're short of funds. Would you mind working as a taxi dancer? And then would you mind just turning a few tricks? And because she's so besotted with him, she goes along with him and is eventually lured into the brothel. Now, this is a very standard story of white slavery, as they called it at the time. And there's that film, Shanghai Lady, from 1929, which tells you all about, again, as you know, the films that were made about Shanghai in the 30s. One of the stock characters is the young ingenue who is tricked into these ghastly circumstances. Right. So that was Emily Hahn's novelistic explanation for why Miss Jewel wound up the way she did. It's not at all clear that is what happened to Lorraine. Not at all clear. To start off with, Lorraine is 6 or 7 years older than Miss Jill. She is not an ingenue. She has travelled around the world on her own. She has lived in big cities. She has been Tokugawa's mistress for 2 years. And by the time she actually goes into work in Madame Louise's brothel, she is 24. So, I mean, that's not to say she wasn't coerced or in some way, sort of driven into the sex trade by forces outside her control, but she did have more agency than Jill did, certainly. And the point is, we do not know how this happened. We do know that for the first 3 months after she was in Shanghai, she was had an affair with an Italian called Leonello Sanseverino. And we do know, or we suspect, that for a while she was back at one of her many trips back to Secretarial College to learn how to be a stenographer typist, upgrade her skills on that. But after that, the record goes blank, and it's not at all clear that she was trafficked and coerced in the sense that we know. Now, that said, at the time she was there in 1934 in Shanghai, there was very little else that she could do to support herself economically. She could perhaps have thrown herself on the mercy of the consular authorities and been sent back to Australia, but I think she desperately didn't want to go back to Australia at that time, given that life there would not have been so good. So that's an open question. Again, Miss Jill says this is displays Miss Jill is the narrative in terms of an orthodox narrative of reform, sin for reform. In reality, it was probably more nuanced than that.
I think it's worth perhaps talking a little bit about the bordello culture that Lorraine finds herself in, because this is a long-established clutch of bordellos and establishments, which is right close. I forget the actual address of Emily Hahn's flat. She had one of the corner houses just somewhere. There's people on here that will know that address. I can't remember it, but it's very close to the Kiangsi Road, now Jiangshilu, strip of bordellos, which then also ran onto what is now Hong Kong Road, which is now Xiangyanglu, and South Suzhou Road, so that runs along the Suzhou Creek on the southern side. And they were in those houses. Those were the famous, American girl bordellos, the white bordellos that had been in business really since the 1890s, and became very famous. And the American authorities had tried to stamp them out in the early part of the century, unsuccessfully. They'd managed to keep going. And we know that within those bordellos, although they were referred to as American girls, there were many French, British, Australian, all sorts went in there. It was a sort of a generic term by that point. And they were really sort of towards, they were past their heyday by this point, but they were not kind of, if you have sort of rankings of bordellos, I mean, they were reasonably smart houses, smart establishments, smart resorts, as they used to say at the time, run by madams. They weren't kind of, to use colloquial terms, what we might just call sort of basic knocking shops, right? They were kind of, not cheap places to go. They tended to attract men from the, Shanghai lander men from higher echelon of society. I think I'm right in saying. I mean, what do we know about the establishment she went to?
Okay, well, the establishment she worked in Miss Jill, it's called Madame Annette's. In China to me, it's called Madame Louise's. I think Louise's is the right name because that's the name that Lorraine used in her personal correspondence with Emily Hahn. Okay. So Emily gives a fairly detailed description of this same establishment in her two books. And basically it's that Madame Louise is someone who has moved very much by the time. I think from what I've read, the point about the Shanghai sex industry was that up until about 1918, it was fairly strictly racially segregated. So that in the white houses on Kiangsi Road, they were run by white mistresses, and they had European American workers, and they were for European and American men. And they did not admit Chinese as either workers or as customers. Then, with the Russian Revolution, there was a flood of white Russian refugees into the city, and these people were desperate, and white Russian women began to accept Chinese men as customers. And when that happened, that revolutionized, that broke down that old racial barrier. So in both her books, Emily is pains to point out that Madame Louise, basically she ran a completely cosmopolitan shop. She only had European, that term needs qualifying, but white women as workers, but she admitted anyone at all, as long as they could pay. So her charges were very high indeed. And I mean, as I think it was Victor Sassoon later noted, that one of Lorraine's customers was TV Sung, the brother of Madame Chiang Kai-shek and the Sung sisters, who at that stage was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in China and in Shanghai. So we're talking about an establishment that is very much at the upper echelons of society. And Lorraine was proud of this. I mean, she wrote a letter to Lorraine, to Emily in the war 5 years later, where she said, now I'm just, nothing, even the meanest little private can yell at me and tell me what to do. And I think, boy, if you'd known me back in the Shanghai days, you would never have even got in the door at Madame Louise's. And that was kind of her sense of how she might have been a whore, but she was a high class one. And that was a really big thing. So now, as far as as you say, the workforce in this, basically Louise's whole approach is to keep things exclusive. So she doesn't want too many of any particular. There are Americans, there are French, there are Georgians, and there are a lot of Russians, but they all pretend not to be Russians. They're all something else. And of course, Lorraine stands out because she's the only one who's British. Being a good Australian in the 1930s, she regards herself as British. She's proud to be British, and rather than disguising her identity, she flaunts it.
Okay. Now, we know Emily Hahn is living just up the road from all of these bordellos. And we're talking now, I mean, we're talking mid-30s, right? So into 1935, into 1936, I think, right? And she's living up the road. In China, to me, she says that when she took the flat, it was unfurnished, and she bought all of her furniture off of one of the brothel madams who was having a refit, I guess, and decided to get rid of some of her furniture, which I don't think there's a picture, unfortunately, of Emily Hahn's flat. It's a wonderful idea that she had all this old bordello furniture that she'd invite you around for drinks to sit on. But so how long is she in the bordello business, and how does she get out of it but stay in Shanghai?
She's in the brothel for 2 years. Then in early 1936, there's been a guy who's been hanging around her in Madame Louise's for a long time now. Now we enter Mr. Edmund Toeg. Now the Toegs were a Sephardic Jewish clan of Iraqi origin. They were a kind of cadet branch or associated with the Sassoon family. And Edmund Toeg's father had been brought to Shanghai in the first instance through the Sassoon connection. Edmund was, for example, a cousin of Victor Sassoon, and there were all these kind of interrelationships between the two families. So the family business, they're exchange brokers. And so Edmund is a very smart businessman. He was raised in England as a teenager. He spent the years probably about 1907 to about 1915 or 1916, and that made him culturally an Edwardian gentleman. So Edmund basically takes an interest in Lorraine, and he says, you've got to get out of this. there's a better life for you than this. So he supports her to leave Madame Louise's. He supports her to move into a block of flats. And then his plan for her, his plan A, is go to secretarial college, get yourself a good job as a typist, and then you will attract the right sort of bloke. So he's thinking some upright, clean-living young man off the ship from, London or San Francisco or wherever, who will probably never find out about her past, but will make her an honest woman. The reason why Edmund can't marry her himself is because his family is very important and well connected in Shanghai. His father, by this stage, is dead, but his mother, Sophia, she's quite a big deal. She's prominent in Zionist causes, Zionist fundraisers. His sister, Nora, she is a teacher at the Shanghai Jewish School. His sister, Dora, has married a Greek diplomat and gone with him back to Athens. So the Toegs are well connected, and it's just not in contemplation that Edmund would marry a former inmate of Madame Louise's brothel, because if it ever came out, that would deal a fatal blow to the Toegs and maybe the Sassoons' social profile. So that's not going to happen. But as Emily said, he was very much in love with her. And so you've got this rather odd situation where he's paying for her, urging her to go straight, at sometimes sort of shoving her into the arms of men who he think would make suitable husbands, but at the same time really is passionate about her himself. So that's where we're at. She gets out of the brothel in early 38, and until about early 36, I beg your pardon, and for the next 18 months, she's in this kind of no man's land where she's trying to fit in with Edmund's wishes, but she's having trouble sticking to the plan.
Okay, but there's also a very interesting moment here, which takes us into Black Saturday in August 1937 and the bombing of the accidental bombing of Shanghai, but the very definite, the very non-accidental Japanese shelling of Chinese portions of Shanghai, where she's hanging out with all of the foreign press corps, right? And she gets to know all the different journalists, and she interacts with a lot of those. And I don't know how that does that come about through knowing Emily Hahn? I mean, is that because those are the circles she's mixing in as well?
At this stage, Emily has bumped into her once or twice through the intercession of Edmund Toeg, but they are not as yet friends. I think basically, well, first off, you're absolutely right. The Battle of Shanghai was the hinge of Lorraine's life, because that saw the people who she met and the horizons that opened up during that very brief period basically took her out of this rather secluded, inward-looking, uninvolved kind of life. And all of a sudden she was mixing it with people whose jobs were war correspondents. And they were on about politics, and they were all about taking sides between the Japanese and the Chinese. And they were all about sort of questions of morality. And they were, journalists. So, okay, I don't know how she met the first of these, who was the Italian, Luigi Barzini, but it may well have been just at a party or something like that. So her first relationship in this time was with the Italian Luigi Barzini, but at the same time, she met at least 3 other journalists during that time, the Battle of Shanghai, with whom she would stay in touch and with whom she would reconnect in Sydney 5 years later. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The Battle of Shanghai was a dramatic turning point for her.
Yeah, and I mean, she's actually, I think it's in your book, she's friends with Pembroke Stevens, who was the Daily Telegraph, the UK Daily Telegraph correspondent, and he died. I mean, he was shot in the head near the old town in Shanghai by a Japanese sniper trying to cover the war there. Yeah. But the other interesting one that she knows is Bob, as he was known, Bob Horiguchi, who had been a correspondent for the Japanese newspapers, but had become a spokesperson for the Imperial Japanese Army, and therefore had become within the press corps a little bit. I mean, he was someone they had to interact with to get news, but had become kind of persona non grata, right, due to due to his job with the Japanese. And yet she seems to maintain a relationship with him. And I think you suggest, you know, a very close relationship, perhaps even a intimate relationship.
No, Horiguchi was a controversial figure. Throughout this whole period, he wore two hats. He remained a correspondent for Dome right throughout till 1940. So he was a paid-up journalist, but at the same time, he was also a spokesman for the Imperial Japanese Army. He appeared in uniform at their press conferences and did all the things that spokesmen did, spinning stuff, nudging questions out of the way, etc., etc., etc. He was detested by other journalists, in particular Norman Alley, who would become another of Lorraine's lovers later on down the track. Now, Alley, of course, is famous because he was the film cameraman who filmed the bombing attack on USS Panay. Anyway, in his book, Eyewitness, Alley talks about Horiguchi and said how he was quite convinced that Horiguchi had engineered the killing of Stevens because he had already fallen out with Stevens, because Stevens was always mocking and ridiculing him in all the Japanese line in press conferences. And he was quite sure, Alley is quite sure, that Horiguchi was on the Japanese side of the lines when Stevens was shot. And he said he's sure that he pointed out Stevens, who had taken inside the French concession, but within reach of Japanese fire. So, Alley was absolutely convinced that. So now, but then, as you said, Lorraine basically started an affair with Horiguchi. And this started, I think, probably around October, November 1938. And it probably kept going through till about August 1939.
Right, and causes a rift between her and Emily Hahn. Right.
Well, Emily almost kicks her out.
Yeah,
and this is the point, because I try to point out that as the war got closer, as the horror of the Sino-Japanese War sunk in to observers like Emily in Shanghai, as war in Europe grew closer, as you had Munich, as you had the Chinese armies losing battle after battle, losing Wuhan and being pushed further and further back towards Chongqing. As all this was happening, it was a time for taking sides. And Lorraine, by her choice of Horiguchi as a lover, seemed to have come down on the other side. So Emily and her cohort were all supporters of the Chinese cause. They were all liberals / leftists. Emily was, for a while, what you would call a fellow traveller with the Communist Party, particularly with her good friend, later enemy, Agnes Smedley, right? So these were all people who are very much anti-fascist, anti-militarist on the left, and yet here is Lorraine going off with Horiguchi. And to make things worse, Horiguchi was actually married to an American, and here was Lorraine, sort of destroying their marriage. So so that was definitely a thing. And later on, Lorraine's relationship with Horiguchi and with Barzini and with Tokugawa got into a fair bit of trouble in Australia after the war broke out with the security authorities. Yeah, because they said, "What are you doing with all these people?"
And well, it's always the problem of living in a cosmopolitan society, isn't it? That it always comes back to bite you with people who are kind of later on become persona non grata elsewhere. We should move on fairly quickly so that we can get some questions. In the book, the last part of the book, Miss Jill goes down to Hong Kong, and there's a whole storyline there, which is sort of where Emily Hahn's own life experience bleeds into the Miss Jill story. But how does Lorraine get out of Shanghai, and where does she go?
She left Shanghai in August 1939 to go back to Australia to see her family, who she hadn't seen for 8 years. Her intention was to go back there just for a couple of months. Hi, Mum, great to see you again, and then go back. Now, at this stage, Edmund Toeg was still paying her a fairly substantial allowance. And she gets back to Australia, and World War II breaks out. And what that means is from now on, she has to obtain a security clearance to leave Australia. And when she, after a couple of months, decides to go back to, she hates Australia, can't stand it. She raises to go back to Shanghai, and the security authorities won't give her an exit passport because they said, look, you've been involved with all these Axis people, and like, what are you going to do when you get there? So she thought she was going to be there for a couple of months. She wound up being there for 8 years. And you're right, all that narrative about being incarcerated in Hong Kong, being in Stanley internment camp, finding that the experience of internment was a great leveler, which meant that all of the distinctions and the tensions which had applied in colonial society prior to that were kind of smoothed away by the shared hardship of your life. It's a bit like the process that Ballard talked about in Empire of the Sun. But that's not Lorraine's story. That is Emily's perception, Emily's story.
Okay, so we should move on. She's back in Australia for 8 years, and then we can't not talk about the fact that she gets to London, which I guess is the last part of her life, and ends up working in the library at the Royal Asiatic Society by Euston Station.
Right. Well, she got to London in 1947, and she started working for the Royal Asiatic Society in 1969. So what happened in the meantime was, I'm pretty sure that Emily did pay her fare and gave her a job when she got to England. I think the reason was because Miss Jill was just about to come out, and Lorraine said, if this comes out while I'm in Australia, people will know it's me and I won't be able to live here. So I think there was a kind of suggestion there. So she goes to London. Edmund Toeg, who's the businessman who originally supported her to leave the brothel in 1936, he turns up in the UK. And now, because all the conventions of Shanghai society have been destroyed by what's going on in the meantime, they get married. They're free to marry. In the 1950s, they live a life of sort of ease and society. Then she starts to get really serious. By the time she's 45 and 50, her salad days are well behind her, and she's an intellectual to a certain extent. She always had a really good ear for languages, and she was a very avid reader, and she was right on top of modernist artistic and development, stuff like that. So it was natural that she would drift into this milieu. She was helped by the fact that she got these jobs through the Shanghai Lander Mafia. There was a woman called Margaret Marsh, and Margaret Marsh's father had been a doctor in Shanghai, whom Edmund's family had known in the 20s and 30s. So basically, starting in the 60s, Lorraine went to work for the Royal Central Asian Society. Then there was the Army League, which was an army think tank and lobby group headed by General Richard Gale. Then she worked for the Pakistan Society. She was doing ad hoc event organising with Margaret Marsh. And of course, she worked for the Royal Asiatic Society from 1969 to 1980. She was not full-time there, I think. She's about 3 times a week, 4 times a week, stuff like that. But she was definitely part of the scenery, because when the Queen visited the RAS on its 150th anniversary in 1973, Lorraine was presented to her as one of the staff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating because, I mean, anyone who knows the Royal Asiatic Society in London's library is, I think it's fair to say, not one of the hotter spots in the West End of London. And the idea that the old fogies sort of wandering in, looking for an obscure journal and encountering Lorraine Murray with probably, absolutely no idea of her past, rather sort of amuses me, really. And I sort of think that's sort of quite a wonderful story. You should just tell us, what eventually happens to her. But I don't think we've got any questions at the moment. I can't see in the chat at the moment anything. I of course can ask some more. But if you have anything, do put it in. Do type it in, and we can let Richard know. So she works there till 1980. I mean, we have to. What's her final days?
Very sad story. So Edmund Toeg is 14 years older than her. And as he goes into his 70s, the gap between them starts to widen. His health is not good. He has strokes. And just at a time when she's really hitting her straps, she's taking on all this new work. She wants to travel. She's making new friends. She wants to move out of London. Edmund is becoming more and more constrained in his movements, doesn't want to go out, doesn't want to do anything, just wants to have coffee with his cronies and go to the cricket. So this becomes a real tension in their relationship. He dies in 1974. And after that, our information on her almost entirely dries up, because our sources for her life in England are the regular fortnightly airmail that she sent home to her mother. And these there's a huge box of letters, 200 of them, that her niece, Lorraine's niece, has kept in Sydney. And they were, one of my major, wonderful sort of serendipitous finds. But these dry up after 1974. One, because Edmund dies. Two, because Lorraine's mother herself becomes demented and no one's collecting Lorraine's letters anymore. But apparently the rest of the 70s are a kind of happy and prosperous and fulfilling time. That is the testimony of her her friends and her nieces and nephews. She had 16 nieces and nephews, and an awful lot of them went through London at the time and went to stay with her. Then in 1980, disaster struck. She is walking in a London park and she's struck in the head by a soccer ball, which has been kicked at very close range, knocks her down, knocked unconscious, breaks her bones, and not too long after that, dementia begins to set in. So in 1985, the family in Australia sent out a rescue party, and by this stage it's clear she's now 75, but it's clear that she's not coping anymore. She can't look after herself. They take her back to Australia, where she lives for another 15 years, largely unconscious of her surroundings. And she died in Wagga Wagga in the year 2000. So, I mean, yeah, she lived for a long time after that, but basically the story's over by about 75.
Yeah. Okay, but she's long-lived, and Emily is very long-lived as well, of course.
Yes, and unfortunately, I have been in contact with Emily's daughter, Carola Vecchio, who now lives in New York, and she makes a comment. And Carola knew Lorraine very well. Lorraine had been her nanny for a while in the late 40s, and Carola remembers Lorraine very fondly. And she says how sad it was for her mother and herself for this contact that they'd had over 40 years to just basically be turned off. Yeah. Okay.
So the couple of questions we have to ask. One is, she must have read it. What did she think of it?
She was ambivalent about it. She, on the one hand, she was horrified. I'm talking now about China. I'm talking now about China to Me, which has kind of the same facts. I've never heard her actually comment on Miss Jewel, but only commented on China to Me because that came out first. And on the one hand, this is terrible. Everyone will know it's me. Everyone will know I've been a prostitute. I've now exposed, my life. I can't live here anymore, etc., etc. But at the same time, she was incredibly proud and possessive of the fact that she was a character in this best-selling book by Emily Hahn, because on one occasion she heard comments about Miss Jewel hypothesizing, or about Jean, as the character is in China to Me, and hypothesizing about where Jean was, etc., etc. And she was clearly, on the one hand, she was worried about her reputation. On the other hand, she was clearly delighted and chuffed. And of course, by the time we're talking about the RAS in London, all this was decades in the past, and she was well and truly over it. I mean, she had a life, she had a role, and I don't think it kind of worried her that long. But certainly, throughout in the 1930s and the 1940s, she got up every morning and says, what happens if someone finds out that I'm, Jean or Miss Jewel? Definitely.
Well, so we have one other question, which is sort of two parts, really. One, why did she not take a stand against the Japanese when she was in Shanghai, given her friendship group, given the obvious aggression of the Japanese and so on. That's one question. Why did she take that political stance, if it was even as much as a stance? And in the 1950s and onwards, you know, what were her political inclinations then? Obviously, with a very changing China, back in Australia, in the UK, obviously in a very different political environment there. Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. Okay. So as far as her pro-Japanese inclinations, and by the way, in the late 30s, she was intensely pro-Italian as well, meaning Italian fascist as well. And Emily's take on this was that her relationship with Tokugawa had been such a formative part of her experience. And to her, it was just this golden epoch that she had become literally besotted with Japanese, all things Japanese, Japanese culture, Japanese politics, and that therefore she didn't regard it as a betrayal of anything. Rather, she was being true to herself to get herself another Japanese lover. And I think it's worth pointing out that at the time, as everyone knows, there were an awful lot of Westerners on the China coast who supported the Japanese against the Chinese. Said that's what they need, bit of discipline, you know, they'll clean it up and then come in here and
many in Australia, Britain and elsewhere who'd had a fascination with Mussolini's Italy as well.
Absolutely. So that's that, basically because she was besotted with all things Japanese. So 1950s, interesting again, she became basically a very, with one exception, she was conservative. By the time she got to England in 1948, she's like Emily, she's violently anti-communist, violently not just anti-communist, but she's anti-Labor. She's a very strong Tory supporter. Now, there's a very interesting wobble in this about 1958 when Emily's daughter, Carola Vecchio, who I've just mentioned, comes to live in London. And even though she's much younger than Emily, she's obviously got a big impact on the older woman's thinking. And all of a sudden, Lorraine's doing all this kinds of stuff. She's going to anti-apartheid rallies. She's going to volunteer for social work. She's sort of kind of all involved in all these good causes. She gives up supporting the Tories and actually starts supporting the Liberal Party. Now, this doesn't last forever, but I mean, I think it's part of the thing that she was very much a chameleon. She very much tended to take on the colouring and the opinions of the society that she was with. And this, of course, is a perfectly understandable protective response to someone who's felt desperately insecure from day one. But I mean, I've said she was conservative, but she wound up being an ardent feminist, you know, hailing Germaine Greer and hailing Robin Davidson, etc., etc. So, I mean, there are a lot of nuances in there, but by and large, she was on the right most of her life. Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think we're almost out of time, and Melinda will want to come back to sort of talk a little bit about what's coming up with the RAS and so on. But I should say, Nick, it's an amazing job you've done with this book. You've really just filled in an enormous gap where we didn't even know we had a gap before. You know, this was one of those unknown unknowns where we didn't even know that anything was missing. And you know, for those of us, and I know there's some on this Zoom who are really deep into 1930s Shanghai, this is a very important book. And we should point out it's available from Shanghai's own Earnshaw Books, Graham Earnshaw. You can get it online. I'm sure Melinda still has a code that you can get a slight discount if you're an RAS member on buying the book. It is also available to anyone watching from around anywhere else on all of the usual Amazons, and it's also, I think, on Bookshop now. The book is out there. It's filled in this gap. It's an incredible job you've done. It's incredibly well sourced as well. Actually, I mean, we should have talked maybe more about the sources you had, but anyone reading the book will see that, you know, you've really drilled down and managed to get access to so many records in so many different places, that it's really, really impressive. So I do hope that we can push the book out there and it becomes one of those books on interwar Shanghai that everybody has on their shelf. So that was just brilliant to hear you talking about it as well. Thank you so much. But Melinda, do you want to say something to finish up?
Sure. I'll wrap it up. Thanks to you both. Actually, this was really, really fascinating, and yes, the actual event notice that went out has the discount code on it, and it will still be good. So anyone who wants to, inspired by this conversation, who wants to read the book, who didn't buy it before, you can still get it from Earnshaw Books. Thank you so much, Nick. It was really, there was a lot of interest in this talk, and the kudos are piling in now in the chat function. People really enjoyed it. And Paul, you were a magnificent moderator. You really, pulled out a lot of good nuggets there. And, we kind of got a dynamic duo here of fascinating insights about Shanghai. And I want to thank everyone. And I really only have one of the upcoming events to try to entice people to attend, which is on November 11th. RASBJ will be celebrating its 10th anniversary, and it's going to be a fundraiser and a fundraiser. It's going to be a big party, but it's also going to be a moment where RASBJ wants to give back to the wider community, and is launching a program to donate to good causes in the areas of cultural heritage preservation, the natural world, and arts and society. So there'll be 3 recipients of awards. There'll be a silent auction, which will be a little bit different because it's going to focus on unique experiences and encounters. And indeed, one of the premier offerings there will be Paul French offering to bidders an afternoon in London with author Paul French. Not just that, he'll give you lunch, and he'll also give you, wait for it, I want this myself, a private tour of the exclusive London Library, which has amazing, valuable first editions on a variety of topics. And normally they're accessible only to members and special guests.